There are people in this world who make you believe that goodness is real. Not the kind of goodness that comes from never being tested, the kind that shows up on a Tuesday afternoon when nobody's watching, when there's nothing to gain, when the easiest thing would be to just keep walking and mind your own business. The kind of goodness that holds a whole community together without ever asking for credit, without ever raising its voice, without ever once making you feel like you owe it anything. Most of us know someone like that, or we think we do, because every now and then, the world shows us something that stops us cold, something that reaches into the part of us that still wants to believe in people and quietly, methodically pulls that belief apart thread by thread. And when it happens, when the person you trusted most turns out to be the person you knew least, it doesn't just break your heart. It breaks something deeper than that. It breaks the story you've been telling yourself about the world you live in. This is the story of Everett Malone. And I want you to understand something before we go any further. By the time this story ends, you are going to question everything you think you know about the people sitting closest to you right now. Because Everett Malone was not a stranger. He was not a drifter. He was not a man who slipped through the cracks of a distracted community. He was the center of it. He was the reason people stayed. He was the reason people felt safe. And for 30 years, right beneath the surface of everything that made him beloved, there was a secret so large, so carefully hidden, and so catastrophically destructive that when it finally came out, it did not just end his life. It shattered every single person who had ever called him a friend. Before we go any deeper into this story, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to know which city, which state, which part of this country you're in tonight. And if this story is already pulling at something inside you, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single one of our upcoming videos. Now let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to Cedarfield, Ohio, on a cold morning in March, when the most trusted man in town was found dead in his living room, and nobody, not one single person in that town, could explain why. Cedarfield, Ohio, sits in the middle part of the state in a county most people from the coast have never heard of. It is not a glamorous place, and it has never tried to be. It is the kind of town that has a population sign at the edge of the county road that hasn't needed updating in 20 years because people don't leave Cedarfield very often, and they don't arrive in large numbers either. The main street has a diner that serves breakfast all day, a hardware store that has been owned by the same family since 1967, a post office, 2 churches, and a barber shop where the same 4 men have been sitting in the same 4 chairs arguing about college football every Saturday morning for the better part of 2 decades. The streets are wide and mostly flat. The yards are kept. The neighbors wave. The doors, for the most part, do not get locked at night. It is exactly the kind of American town that people from big cities either romanticize or dismiss. And it is exactly the kind of town where a secret can hide for 30 years because nobody is looking for one. Everett Malone was born in Cedarfield in 1956, the second of 3 children raised by a father who worked at the Midland County Processing Plant and a mother who sewed alterations out of the back bedroom of their house on Garfield Street. They were not wealthy. They were not well-connected. They were the kind of family that made do, that showed up for each other, that measured success by whether the bills got paid and whether the children got to school clean and fed. Everett understood that arithmetic early. He was 16 when his father's back gave out, and he started taking odd jobs on weekends to help with the household expenses. He was 18 when he graduated from Cedarfield High, not at the top of his class, but not far from it, and immediately enrolled at the county community college while keeping his weekend work going and adding a second job at a lumber yard on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He did not complain about any of it. He did not frame it as sacrifice. He just did it the way his parents had done it, the way he understood life was supposed to be done. It was at that lumber yard where Everett Malone met Nathan Briggs. Nathan was 20 years old, 2 years older than Everett, and he had what Everett did not: a natural ease with people, a laugh that filled a room, an ability to make a stranger feel like an old friend inside of 4 minutes. Where Everett was steady and quiet and measured, Nathan was electric. Where Everett listened, Nathan talked. Where Everett thought things through for a week before acting, Nathan had already made the decision, placed the bet, and was halfway through celebrating the outcome before Everett had finished reading the terms. They were, in every obvious way, opposites, and they became, almost immediately, inseparable. By the time Everett was 22 and Nathan was 24, they had drawn up a plan on a paper napkin at the Cedarfield diner to start their own contracting business. They shook hands over a cup of coffee. They each put in $3,000 of saved money. And Malone and Briggs Construction was born from the back of a pickup truck and a willingness to work longer hours than anyone else in the county. By the time Everett was 30, Malone and Briggs had built a reputation that no advertising could have bought. They did the job right the first time. They showed up on the day they said they would. They charged a fair price, and they did not cut corners. In a county where a handshake was still considered a binding agreement, Everett Malone's handshake was worth more than most men's contracts. He became a deacon at First Baptist Church of Cedarfield at the age of 32, a position he held without interruption for the next 35 years. He coached Little League for 11 seasons. He organized the annual winter clothing drive that collected donations for 3 counties. He once spent his own personal money, quietly and without announcement, to repair the roof of an elderly woman named Miss Lillian on the east side of town after a bad ice storm took half of it off, and she had no insurance and no family within driving distance. Miss Lillian only found out it was Everett when the crew accidentally left a Malone and Briggs invoice under her welcome mat. She called him to thank him. He told her not to worry about it and changed the subject. That is the story people in Cedarfield tell when they want to explain who Everett Malone was. Not the business, not the church position. That story. About the roof. About the invoice. About the way he changed the subject. Ruth Harmon became Ruth Malone on a Saturday afternoon in June of 1981 at First Baptist Church of Cedarfield, in a ceremony attended by what seemed like half the county. She was 24 years old, and she had been a librarian's assistant at the Cedarfield Public Library for 2 years, and everyone who knew her agreed that she was exactly the kind of woman who belonged in a library, not because she was quiet, but because she was precise. Ruth Malone had a way of understanding things. She read people the way she read books, carefully, with full attention, noticing the things between the lines just as much as the things written directly on the page. She was the kind of woman who remembered your birthday without a reminder, who noticed when you were carrying something heavy even when you hadn't said a word about it, who could sit across from you at a kitchen table over a cup of tea and make you feel more understood in 45 minutes than you had felt in the previous year. She and Everett had 2 children, a son named Marcus, born in 1983, and a daughter named Diane, born in 1986. Both of them grew up in a house where the word they used most often to describe their parents' marriage was stable. Not exciting, not dramatic. Stable. The way a foundation is stable. The kind of thing you don't think about because you never have to. Because it has always been there, and you cannot imagine a version of the world in which it would not be. Nathan Briggs married a woman named Carla in 1984, and they had 3 children of their own. Everett was the godfather to Nathan's eldest son, Dwayne. Nathan was the godfather to Marcus. The 2 families spent holidays together. They went on fishing trips together every spring up to a lake in northern Ohio that Nathan had found years before and never shared with anyone else. Their wives became close friends. Their children grew up knowing each other the way cousins do, not by choice exactly, but by proximity and repetition, and the simple fact that the adults who loved them also loved each other. Cedarfield held all of it, the business and the friendship and the families and the church and the Little League, in the specific way that small towns hold things, with the kind of collective memory that never fully lets go of anything, that keeps a story alive long after the people in it have stopped telling it themselves. Nobody noticed anything different about Everett Malone in the beginning. That is always the first thing people say afterward, when they are looking back, and trying to find the moment when the thread started to pull loose. They say they didn't notice. And then, slowly, when they are pressed, when someone asks them to really think about it, they begin to remember small things. A look, a pause that lasted a beat too long. A moment where Everett started a sentence and then stopped and redirected it somewhere safer. His daughter Diane would later say that the first time she thought something might be wrong with her father was a Sunday afternoon in October of the year before he died. She had stopped by the house for lunch after church and found him standing in the backyard by himself, just standing there, not doing anything, not looking at anything in particular. She had called his name from the back door, and he had turned around and smiled, and said he was just getting some air. But the smile, she said, took a second to arrive, like he had to remember to put it on. She had not thought much of it at the time. She had put it down to tiredness. He was 67 years old. Men his age got tired. It wasn't until everything came out that she understood she had been watching her father carry a weight that would have broken most people years before. The weight had a name. It had a dollar amount. It had a paper trail that stretched back 30 years and ran through the books of Malone and Briggs construction like a hidden river running beneath solid ground, invisible on the surface, carving everything hollow underneath. It had a face, too, a woman named Delia Sparks who lived in Columbus, Ohio, 90 miles east of Cedarfield, and who had been connected to Everett Malone's life and his silence for longer than most people in Cedarfield had known him. And it had a source, a beginning, a single decision made by Nathan Briggs in the early years of the business when the company was barely surviving, and Nathan, faced with the possibility of losing everything he had built, made a choice that he never told his partner about until it was already done and already irreversible. The year was 1993. Malone and Briggs was 5 years old and struggling through a stretch of bad winters and a county economy that had slowed significantly after a large manufacturing plant reduced its workforce by 40%. Nathan had been approached by a man named Gerald Rowe, a Columbus-based contractor with connections to several county and state government procurement offices. Gerald Rowe had a proposal, a simple one, in the way that proposals designed to destroy you are always simple at first. Malone and Briggs would be awarded a series of government infrastructure contracts, road work, public building renovation, school repair, at bid prices that were significantly inflated above actual cost. The excess, after the work was completed, would be divided between Rowe's network and Malone and Briggs, with a portion being laundered back through the books as legitimate business expenses. Nathan would manage the financial arrangement. Everett would manage the work. And as long as nobody looked too closely at the numbers, the business would survive the slow years and come out the other side solvent and positioned for growth. Nathan said yes. He said yes without telling Everett. He processed the first contract, completed the paperwork, deposited the first check, and set up the financial arrangement that would funnel money through the business for the next 3 decades. And then, when the first contract was complete and the first inflated payment had cleared, he sat Everett down at the desk in the back office of Malone and Briggs and told him what he had done. Not to ask permission, not to confess, to inform, because the money was already in the account and the agreement was already in place, and Nathan had decided, in the way that he always decided things, that the outcome justified the method and that Everett, once he understood the situation clearly, would agree. Nathan Briggs had always believed that Everett Malone, given enough time, would come around to his way of seeing things. He had been right about that many times over the course of their friendship. He was about to be catastrophically wrong. Everett Malone sat in that office for a long time without speaking. The people who know him best say that when Everett was truly angry, he did not raise his voice. He went quiet. Not the quiet of a man retreating, the quiet of a man deciding. He asked Nathan to repeat what he had said, slowly. Nathan did. He explained the structure of the arrangement. He explained the figures. He explained that the risk was minimal because the contracts had already been approved through channels that Rowe controlled. He explained that this was how business worked at a certain level and that Malone and Briggs was now operating at that level whether Everett liked it or not. When Nathan finished, Everett stood up, walked out of the office, drove home, and did not speak to Nathan for 11 days. At the end of those 11 days, he came back. He did not withdraw from the business. He did not go to the authorities. He did not confront Gerald Rowe. He came back, sat down at the same desk, and told Nathan one thing: that he would not touch the money, that he would manage the work and nothing else, and that this arrangement would end the moment the business was stable enough to walk away from it. Nathan agreed to those terms, and Everett Malone spent the next 30 years discovering that some arrangements, once you are inside them, do not have an exit. The reason he stayed was Ruth. The reason he stayed was Marcus and Diane. The reason he stayed was the house on Garfield Street and the church where he had been a deacon for 20 years and the town that had given him everything he had ever built. The reason he stayed was the specific and devastating fear that if he walked away, if he reported what had happened, if he turned the whole structure over to investigators, the fall would not just take Nathan and Gerald Rowe. It would take him. It would take his name. It would take everything his family had. It would take the roof over his children's heads and the trust of the community that had made him what he was. And Everett Malone, for all his courage in every other part of his life, could not do that to the people he loved. So he stayed, and he was quiet, and he watched the money move through the business year after year and told himself that he was protecting his family, and somewhere, in a part of himself he could not always reach, he knew that was only half of the truth. Delia Sparks had known about the arrangement since 1994, when she was 32 years old and working as an administrative contractor for Gerald Rowe's Columbus office. She had processed enough of the paperwork to understand exactly what was happening and exactly what it meant. When Rowe's network eventually shifted away from the specific county contracts in the late 1990s, Delia found herself holding information that had value, not to authorities, because she had been part of the operation long enough to be implicated herself, but to Everett Malone, who needed her silence the way a man who is underwater needs to believe the surface is still up there somewhere. The arrangement between Everett and Delia was not romantic. It was not warm. It was the coldest kind of business arrangement there is, the kind built entirely on mutual exposure and mutual fear. He paid her, in modest and carefully timed amounts over the years, to keep what she knew to herself. She accepted the payments, and she kept what she knew to herself. And for 25 years that arrangement held, in the way that arrangements built on fear tend to hold. Not forever, but long enough to make everyone involved believe that forever might be possible. It was a federal audit that broke the hold. In the spring of the year before Everett died, a routine review of county infrastructure contracts going back 15 years flagged a pattern of irregularities in several projects that included work done by Malone and Briggs. The audit was quiet at first, internal, preliminary, conducted by a team of federal accountants who sent a standard records request to the county procurement office. But Nathan Briggs had maintained a contact inside that office for years, a man who owed him a favor of the kind that people in small counties owe each other, and that contact made a phone call. Nathan got word of the audit 11 months before Everett died. He sat with that information for 3 days before he decided what it meant. What it meant, in Nathan's calculation, was that the arrangement was about to unravel. What it also meant, in that same calculation, was that Everett Malone was the only living person who could speak with direct knowledge about what had happened inside Malone and Briggs, because Nathan had, over the years, been very careful to ensure that the paper trail pointed toward the partner who had signed the work orders, the partner who had approved the project completions, the partner whose name was on the operational documentation. The financial side of the arrangement ran through accounts and structures that Nathan controlled. But the work side, the day-to-day operations, the contracts, the approvals, those bore Everett's signature. And Nathan Briggs understood, with the cold and patient clarity that had always defined the way he made decisions, what that meant for his own survival. 14 months before Everett Malone died, Nathan Briggs walked into an insurance broker's office in a city 40 minutes outside of Cedarfield and opened a life insurance policy on his business partner in the amount of $2 million. He listed himself as the co-beneficiary through the business structure. He signed the policy authorization forms himself using a signature for Everett Malone that he had spent 3 evenings practicing. The broker, who had no reason to question the documentation, processed the policy without incident. The monthly premiums were paid from a subsidiary account within the Malone and Briggs financial structure, an account that, on paper, existed to cover equipment depreciation and replacement costs. Nathan did not tell Everett about the policy. He did not mention it in any of their Thursday lunches or their spring fishing trips or any of the dozens of ordinary conversations they had over those 14 months about the business and the town and their grandchildren and whether the Bengals had any realistic shot at the playoffs. He carried it the way he had learned to carry things, in silence, with patience, with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 30 years hiding one thing or another. Everett began feeling unwell in the late summer of that final year. He attributed it first to the heat, then to stress, then to the general accumulated fatigue of being a man of 67 with a body that had spent 4 decades doing physical work. Ruth watched him lose weight over the course of 4 months. She watched the color go out of his face. She watched him come home from his Thursday lunches with Nathan increasingly drained, increasingly pale, increasingly unlike himself. She told him to see the doctor. He saw the doctor twice. The first visit produced a diagnosis of stress and mild anemia and a recommendation to rest more and eat better. The second visit, 2 months later, produced a referral to a specialist that Everett scheduled and then quietly canceled without telling Ruth. He had begun to understand by that point, in a way he could not yet fully articulate even to himself, that what was happening to him was not something a specialist could address. He had begun to notice the pattern. He had begun to count the Thursdays. Everett Malone spent the last 3 months of his life doing something that nobody in Cedarfield would have thought him capable of doing, because nobody in Cedarfield had ever seen the version of Everett Malone that existed behind the steady and undemanding exterior. He gathered evidence. He did it carefully, methodically, with the same quiet precision that had made him an excellent contractor and an excellent deacon and an excellent father. He pulled financial records from the business archives that he had stored in duplicate on a personal hard drive years before, when he had first understood that he might someday need them. He recorded audio of 2 conversations, one with Delia Sparks, conducted over the phone, in which Delia, without fully realizing she was being recorded, confirmed the nature of their arrangement and its origins. And he recorded one conversation with Nathan Briggs, at their last Thursday lunch together, in which Nathan said things that, taken out of the context of 30 years of shared history, would sound to a jury like exactly what they were. He stored everything on a small USB drive. He placed that drive inside a hollowed-out copy of a John Steinbeck novel on the 3rd shelf of the bookcase in the living room, the shelf that Ruth Malone, as a woman who had spent her professional life surrounded by books, dusted and reorganized twice a year. He knew she would find it. He knew she would know what to do with it. And then he wrote a letter, placed it unsealed in his home office, and locked the door from the inside. He was found the next morning by his wife of 38 years, in his armchair, the television still running, a glass of water on the table beside him, looking, to everyone who saw him, like a man who had simply gone to sleep. Detective Carol Ashford had worked homicides and suspicious deaths in Midland County for 22 years when the call came in on the morning of March the 4th. She was 53 years old, quietly tenacious in a way that had made her both the most effective investigator in the department and occasionally the most frustrating colleague, because Carol Ashford did not close cases that weren't closed, and she did not accept conclusions that weren't supported. She arrived at the Malone house 40 minutes after the first officers. She walked through each room twice before she said anything. She looked at the kitchen, the bedroom, the hallway, the bathroom. She looked at the living room where Everett sat in his chair with the water glass and the running television. And then she found the door at the back of the hallway, solid wood, closed, locked from the inside. And she stopped. She asked the first officers whether they had been inside that room. They had not. She asked whether there was a key. There was not. She stood in front of that door for a full minute before she asked for a toolkit and opened it herself. Inside the office, a desk for filing cabinets, a wall safe, and an envelope on the desk. Unsealed. Addressed to Ruth. Carol Ashford read the letter first, before anyone else, because that is the kind of investigator she was. The kind who understands that the first person to read something changes what it means to everyone who reads it afterward. When she came out of that office, she told the medical examiner to hold the body. She told the first officers to call it a suspicious death. And she drove back to her office, sat down at her desk with a cup of coffee she did not drink, and began. The letter was not a confession. It was not a detailed account of 30 years of fraud and silence. It was a man's letter to his wife, direct and precise in the way that Everett Malone had always been direct and precise, absent of self-pity, full of the specific weight of a man who knows he is not going to be able to finish what he started. He told Ruth he loved her. He told her he was sorry. He told her that he had done something he could never fully explain, but that she deserved to understand, and that everything she needed to understand it was on the drive in the Steinbeck novel on the third shelf. He told her that the man responsible for what was happening to him was someone she knew, someone they had both known for most of their adult lives, and that she should give whatever she found to a detective named Carol Ashford, because he had looked Carol Ashford up and he believed she was the kind of person who finished things. He ended the letter by telling Ruth to look at the garden in spring and remember that he had loved every single morning of the life they had built together, even the hard ones, even the ones he had not handled well. Ruth Malone, when Carol Ashford sat across from her at the kitchen table and walked her through the contents of the letter, did not cry immediately. She sat very still, with her hands flat on the table, and she looked at the space between them, and then she said very quietly, "He kept saying he was tired. I kept telling him to go back to the doctor. He said he was fine. He kept saying he was fine." The second autopsy, ordered by Detective Ashford and conducted by a forensic pathologist out of Columbus with specific toxicological expertise, found what the first autopsy had not been looking for and therefore had not found. Traces of a compound, synthetic, carefully dosed, designed to accumulate gradually in the body and produce symptoms that mirrored natural cardiac deterioration, were present in Everett Malone's tissue at levels consistent with months of repeated low-dose exposure. The compound was not exotic. It was not something that required specialized connections to obtain. It was something that a careful person with access to basic pharmaceutical channels and enough patience could acquire without drawing attention to themselves. What it required, above everything else, was time and access, and the kind of close, trusted, regular contact that meant nobody would ever think to ask how it got in. Every Thursday, for 7 months, his best friend, the man who had been there when his children were born and when his parents died, who had sat beside him in that fishing boat every spring for 40 years, who had shaken his hand on a paper napkin business plan and built a life alongside him that the whole town of Cedarfield had looked at as proof that loyalty meant something. Nathan Briggs had been poisoning Everett Malone one Thursday at a time, in amounts small enough to be invisible, with the patience of a man who believed that time was always on his side. The investigation moved quickly once the toxicology report came back. Financial forensics had already been working through the Malone and Briggs records for 3 weeks by that point, and the picture they were building from 30 years of transactions was extensive and deeply damaging. The inflated government contracts, the subsidiary accounts, the laundering structure that Rose Network had established and that Nathan had maintained with careful, methodical attention long after Roe himself had moved on. The insurance policy, forged signature, fraudulent authorization, $2 million payable upon Everett's death. was the piece that the prosecution would later describe as the clearest window into Nathan's intent. Because a man who takes out a secret life insurance policy on his business partner 14 months before that business partner turns up dead with traces of poison in his blood is not a grieving friend. He is a man who was planning for an outcome and wanted to make sure he would benefit from it. Nathan Briggs was interviewed 3 times before his arrest. He was cooperative, composed, and appeared sincerely devastated by Everett's death in a way that was, by every account from the officers who sat across from him, entirely convincing. He wept in the second interview. He spoke at length about what Everett had meant to him, about the fishing trips and the baseball games and the 40 years of Thursday lunches. He spoke about Ruth and the children and how much he was going to miss being part of that family. He volunteered documents. He provided his financial records without being asked. He said twice, unprompted, that he wanted to do everything in his power to help the investigators find out what had really happened. He was performing, with the fluency of a man who had been performing for decades, and he was doing it well enough that 2 of the 3 detectives who interviewed him left the room genuinely uncertain of his involvement. Carol Ashford did not leave uncertain. Carol Ashford had read the letter. Carol Ashford had listened to the audio recordings on the USB drive that Ruth Malone had found on the 3rd shelf of the living room bookcase, inside a hollowed-out copy of a Steinbeck novel, exactly where Everett had told her to look. And Carol Ashford, in the 37-minute recording that Everett had made at that final Thursday lunch, had heard Nathan Briggs say, in his own voice, in his own words, without knowing he was being recorded, exactly enough. Nathan's defense team was skilled and well-funded, and they understood from the first day of the trial that their best chance was to attack the evidence piece by piece rather than offer an alternative explanation. They challenged the toxicology report on technical grounds. The compound was rare enough that they could find experts willing to dispute the methodology of the analysis and the interpretation of the tissue levels. They attacked Delia Sparks on the stand with precision and persistence, presenting her decades of payments from Everett as evidence of a compromised witness with her own legal exposure and her own reasons for shaping a narrative that kept her out of a courtroom. They reframed the insurance policy as a standard business arrangement that had been documented improperly due to a clerical miscommunication. Not fraud, not intent, just the kind of paperwork error that happened in small businesses that didn't have full-time legal staff. And they presented Nathan himself as a man who had devoted his life to his community, who had built something lasting and real alongside his best friend, who was being accused of the unthinkable based on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of people with reasons to deflect their own responsibility onto him. It was a competent defense. At certain moments during the first 2 weeks of the trial, it was an effective one. And Nathan Briggs, who had sat through all of it with the composed and quietly wounded expression of a man wrongly accused, allowed himself, in those moments, to believe he was going to walk out of that courtroom. He had not accounted for 37 minutes of his own voice. The audio recording was admitted into evidence after the defense's challenge to its authenticity was rejected by the judge, based on 3 independent forensic audio analyses that confirmed the recording was unaltered and the voices were identifiable with a high degree of certainty. It was played in its entirety in open court. The courtroom was very quiet throughout. The recording was not a confession in any theatrical sense. Everett had not confronted Nathan directly, had not accused him of anything outright, because he had understood that a direct accusation would produce a denial and nothing more. Instead, the recording was a conversation, careful, deliberate, circling, in which Everett asked questions and Nathan, comfortable and unguarded over a Thursday lunch with his oldest friend, answered them. He confirmed that he knew about the federal audit. He confirmed that he had concerns about how the documentation from the early years of the business would look to investigators. He spoke in the language of a man managing a situation rather than grieving a friendship. And at one point, toward the end of the recording, in a moment that the prosecutor would later call the most important 30 seconds of evidence in the entire trial, Nathan Briggs said to Everett Malone, "You should have just trusted me. I was always going to take care of everything." The courtroom was silent for a long moment after those words played. Then the prosecutor reached forward and stopped the recording. And the jury, 12 men and women who had sat through 2 weeks of technical disputes and expert testimony and character testimony, looked at Nathan Briggs with the particular expression of people who have just heard something they cannot unhear. The verdict took 2 days of deliberation. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, financial fraud, conspiracy, and forgery. Nathan Briggs was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He maintained his innocence from the moment the verdict was read until the officers led him from the courtroom. As he was being walked out, he turned once toward the gallery where Ruth Malone sat in the front row, where she had sat every day of the trial, where she had listened to every word and looked at every piece of evidence and watched every witness with the careful and unflinching attention of a woman who had spent her life reading the things that other people left between the lines. Nathan looked at her. Ruth looked back. Neither of them said anything. And then Nathan was gone. The money from 30 years of fraudulent contracts was never fully recovered. Some of it had moved through structures that investigators could trace but not reverse. Some of it had been spent on things that still stood: buildings, roads, renovations, in and around Cedarfield and the surrounding counties. Gerald Rowe, who had moved the bulk of his operation to a different network years before the audit began, cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence and gave up enough information to fill in the gaps in the financial case against Nathan. Delia Sparks testified under a limited immunity agreement and was not charged in connection with the Malone case, though she faced separate civil exposure from the Columbus side of the scheme. She moved out of Ohio the year after the trial concluded and, as far as anyone in Cedarfield knew, did not look back. Ruth Malone sold the house on Garfield Street 18 months after the trial. She moved to a smaller house closer to her daughter Diane and spent the first year doing something that surprised almost everyone who knew her. She started talking. Not about her grief, though she had plenty of that. She started talking to church groups and community organizations and anyone who would listen about what she had learned from Everett's story. Not the crime. Not the betrayal in the theatrical sense that people expected when they heard the word. The other lesson. The quieter and more dangerous one. About what happens when the person you love most decides that keeping you safe means keeping you ignorant. About the specific cruelty that can live inside an act of protection. About the way that silence, even when it comes from love, can become the very thing that destroys what it was trying to preserve. She did not speak about Everett with bitterness. She spoke about him the way you speak about someone who was genuinely good at nearly everything and genuinely catastrophic at one thing, and who paid a price for that one thing that nobody who loved him could have wished on him. She said once, in an interview with a regional magazine, that the hardest part was not the betrayal by Nathan. The hardest part was understanding that Everett had spent 30 years trying to protect her from a truth that was going to find her anyway. That he had given 30 years of his life to keeping a secret that ended up costing him the life he had given those years to protect. She said that when she really sat with that, when she let herself feel the full weight of it, the grief wasn't anger. It was something older than anger. It was something she didn't have a word for in English. Something that felt like watching a man spend his whole life building a wall around a house that was already burning from the inside. There is a moment in every story like this one where you have to stop and ask what it means. Not what it proves, not what the verdict settled, not what the legal record says, but what it actually means in the part of your life where you put down the story and look up and see the faces of the people you trust most. Everett Malone was not a naive man. He was not a weak man. He was a man who understood, from the moment Nathan sat him down in that back office in 1993, exactly what kind of world he had stepped into, and who chose, every single day for 30 years after that, to stay inside it, because the alternative looked like losing everything he loved. Nathan Briggs was not a man consumed by hatred. He was a man consumed by arithmetic. A man for whom the people in his life had always existed in relationship to what they could cost him or provide him. A man who had spent so long managing outcomes that he had lost, somewhere along the way, the ability to feel the weight of what he was managing. And between those two men, one held by love and one held by calculation, Ruth Malone spent 38 years believing she was living inside a partnership when she was actually living inside a performance. She was not foolish for believing it. She was simply trusting. And trust, in the presence of a secret that size, is not a weakness. It is the very thing that makes you vulnerable to exactly this. So here is the question I want to leave you with tonight. And I want you to think about it carefully, not just as a question about Everett and Nathan and Ruth, but as a question about your own life, your own relationships, your own table, and your own Thursday afternoons. If Everett Malone had spoken, if on that morning in 1993, after Nathan sat him down and told him what he had done, Everett had walked out of that office and gone to the authorities instead of going home, what would he have lost? He would have lost the business. He might have lost the house on Garfield Street. He might have spent years navigating the legal consequences of having known about the arrangement, even briefly, even involuntarily. His name in Cedarfield would have carried something it didn't carry before. And all of that is real, and all of it is painful, and none of it is small. But he would have been alive at 68. Ruth would have known the truth. His children would have had a father who chose them over his own fear. And Nathan Briggs would not have spent 14 months at a Thursday lunch table doing what he did. The question is not whether Everett was brave or whether he was cowardly. The question is what silence costs. Not eventually, not in the dramatic final accounting of a criminal case, but every single ordinary day while it is happening. What does it cost to carry something that heavy and call it protection? What does it take from the people around you who love you and don't know what they're living next to? What does it eventually, inevitably take from you? Everett Malone knew, at the end. He had counted the Thursdays. He had read the evidence in his own body. He had left the drive in the Steinbeck novel and written the letter and locked the office door and sat down in his armchair with a glass of water and let the television run. He had done everything he could do, in the time he had left, to make sure the truth would outlive him. And it did. It outlived him, and it found Nathan Briggs, and it brought Ruth Malone to a smaller house and a different kind of life. But Everett Malone was not there to see any of it. And that is what the secret cost. That, in the end, is exactly what the secret cost. Drop your thoughts in the comments right now. Would you have done what Everett did? Is there a point where protecting the people you love becomes the most dangerous thing you can do for them? Tell me where you stand. And if this story reached you, if it made you look up from the screen and think about someone you know or something you've been carrying, then you already know why we tell these stories here. This is Mind Maze Stories, and we will see you in the next one.